Good day, everyone. Welcome to all of our viewers watching here online in the Philippines and worldwide. This is the Public Sector Productivity Webisodes. I'm Gerard Calambro and I will be your host for today. Yesterday, we had a very relevant lecture on futures thinking. We had an overview of the concept and discussed foresight methodologies, scenarios, types of futures, and the principles of scenario planning. Today, we will tackle the steps in strategic foresight using scenario development. But before we begin the lecture, let us give a warm shout out again to all of our attendees coming from the different government agencies such as the Department of Health, the Department of Finance, the Philippine Merchant Marine Academy, Mariano Marcos State University, the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, the Commission on Human Rights, the Nueva Ecija University of Science and Technology, the Development Bank of the Philippines, the Bureau of Plant Industry, and the Philippine Ports Authority. To the ones that I haven't mentioned, thank you for joining us today and welcome to this webisode. Let me introduce our speaker once again. Our speaker is currently the Vice President and Managing Director of the DAP Corporate Concern Center, and he is also the Senior Executive Fellow of the Council of Fellows of the Development Academy of the Philippines. Let us all welcome for the second time, Dr. Alan Cajes. Good afternoon, Dr. Cajes.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Good day to each and everyone. Welcome to our second day webinar. And this time, we talk about the strategic foresight using the scenario planning methodology, which is a specific application of futures thinking. Now, a slide I presented yesterday shows this public sector organization that can be a national government agency or a GOCC or a government corporation, a state university or college, or a local government unit. But for this afternoon, we assume that our work in progress scenario plan is for a provincial local government unit with the following indicative strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It has stable allocation from GAA. There is insufficient human capital as a weakness. There is an opportunity for or to access grants from the national government. But there are also threats such as the disruptive events, including the pandemic that we're experiencing now or similar events in the future, economic shocks, and climate change. Now, for this provincial LGU to make sure that it has a good way of surviving in the future, it creates at least 4 scenarios or stories, because the critical uncertainties, especially the threats, are so pronounced that any of these disruptive events may cause a change in the future, which will also affect the kind of future that might happen. So the LGU or the provincial LGU looks at 4 stories or scenarios in the future: the current scenario, the better than current scenario, the ideal scenario, and the preferred scenario. So any of these scenarios will happen in the future given the different disruptive events that might come along the way. Now, for this LGU to have a robust strategy or matatag na strategiya upang magiging survivor ang isang LGU, no? Kahit anong mangyari sa kinabukasan. So the LGU would like to ask the question, what are the robust or best possible strategies to deal with the uncertain futures? Now, going back to the scenario development process, these are the key steps in doing the scenarios or preparing the scenarios. We identify the driving forces in order to answer the question, where are we now? Next is to identify the critical uncertainties to answer the question, where do we want to go? And what are the critical uncertainties we are dealing with? Next is to develop the plausible scenarios to answer the question, what will happen in the future? And next is to discuss implications and paths. To answer the question, if this was the world we would see in the future, what would we do? Yesterday, I also presented the 7 steps to developing scenarios. So we will go to each of these steps. Framing challenge, number 1, driving forces, number 2, building blocks, number 3, scenario frameworks, number 4, scenario stories, number 5, implications and options, number 6, and indicators and signposts, number 7. But before we proceed, here are some scenario ground rules that I'd like you to bring with you in this quick journey. The first is be a learner. Be open to new ideas. Challenge your own assumptions, but do not challenge the assumptions of others or your participants in the discussion during the scenario development process. Ask clarifying questions, or you may clarify, but refrain from arguing with one another. The next is to be creative, have fun, suspend disbelief. Think of the 3 F's in storytelling. What is or what are the facts? What is fictional and what is fantasy? Be present. Some of you mentioned the theory you yesterday. Yes, theory you and the levels of listening, especially generative listening, is very important so that you can have full participation from the participants. Of course, there is space for conversation, and make sure that everybody is there, not on a part-time mode or basis. Be open and honest, no false consensus. Agree to disagree, but then forge consensus at a later time. No attribution outside the room. You are free to use the information shared by your colleagues inside the room, but do not tell or refrain from telling people outside the room who is telling what, because that will discourage stakeholders from sharing their ideas. So here are some of the ground rules, because when you go through the scenario development process, you will need about 3 or more individuals, to develop the scenarios. 5 or more individuals will be better. Now, the 7 steps to developing scenarios, we start with framing challenge. Every scenario must clearly state the strategic challenge or a strategic problem that your organization is facing. So think about your organization. What do you think are the significant or critical problems or strategic challenge that you are facing right now? And this strategic challenge does not require a simple solution. A simple solution is needed for technical problems. So for example, if your computer is broken or if the computer does not open or does not function, you will need a computer technician to fix that. Problems like that do not need to go through a strategic foresight scenario development process. It will be a waste of time and effort for the participants because there is an easy solution. If there is a technical problem, there is a technical solution to that. What we need for strategic challenge are adaptive types of problems, especially those that require perspectives, inputs, and suggestions or possible solutions from other stakeholders, which means that the appropriate responses of the stakeholders discussing the problem will also be dependent on an uncertain future. So there are 3 elements that we can see here. The strategic challenge is relevant to the organization, especially in terms of its survival or in pursuing its mandate. The second is that it is not a simple problem. It is an adaptive challenge. And number 3, it is the solution to the particular strategic challenge is somehow dependent or influenced by the uncertainty of the future. Because if the future is clear to your organization already, maybe strategic foresight and scenario planning is not the right approach. Only if the uncertainty or the critical uncertainties will have a significant effect on the solution that you're offering to the strategic challenge. So scenarios are the tools that we can use to shed light on the strategic challenge that you're facing. Now, the framing question is related to the concept of divergent thinking and the outside in thinking, which means that we look at the problem this time from the perspective of stakeholders or people outside the organization, especially those who belong within and outside the transactional environment of your respective public sector organization, which means your clients, your customers, your citizens, interested parties, other stakeholders, including oversight agencies. In a way, the framing question sets the scope and the limitation of the scenarios. So, two very important aspects: strategic challenge and framing questions. So, here are examples from the National Economic Development Authority based on the training programs that we have done. How can we support the growth and development of Philippine innovation system? So, you notice that this is a very specific strategic challenge, and NEDA can, or in the case of NEDA, it can have other strategic challenges to consider. So this is just one, and it is very specific. The framing question is, what factors will shape the Philippine innovation ecosystem by 2040? So the framing question is also specified further by the time horizon, which is 2022 to 2040. Another example is from the Department of Foreign Affairs. The strategic challenge is, how can the Philippine Foreign Service be more resilient? And the framing question is, how will the emerging regional architectures affect the work of the Foreign Service? Third, in our example, is from a higher education institution. And the strategic challenge is, what will be our strategies to become a smart science, technology, and innovation university? With the framing question, what will be the global landscape of science, technology, and innovation in higher education by 2032? So as you can see, the framing question provides the scope of the strategic challenge, because in this case, you can limit the framing question, let us say, to the regional, inside the regions of the Philippines, or at the national level, or at the regional or ASEAN region level, for instance, or in the Asia Pacific region, or in the global landscape. So the framing question can also tell you how complex or how difficult and how challenging will be your scenario development process, because some information will be needed in order to make those scenarios. The next slide is about the example that we are using today from a provincial LGU perspective. And the strategic challenge is, how can the provincial LGU effectively contribute towards attaining the sustainable development goals through its programs and services? So we assume that there is a discussion, and the strategic challenge that the participants agreed is something like this. All right. Now, what is the framing question? What will be the national policy environment in the next 10 years? So this LGU is not interested about the ASEAN or the global landscape, but only within the national territory of the country. The time horizon is very clear, from 2022 to 2032, or a span of 10 years. So if you have completed the framing challenge, the strategic challenge and framing question, you are done with step number 1, framing challenge. Then we proceed to step number 2, the driving forces. The driving forces are factors that drive a possible result or impact or outcome of a critical uncertainty. Here is an example from UNESCO. Potential of online learning to increase access to higher education, but the physical spaces of higher education institutions are not likely to disappear if digital divides persist into the future. This driving force tells us or implies at least two things. Number one, you need to invest on alternative learning system using digital platforms, for instance, and at the same time, you have to manage the cost related to your physical assets. Okay, so those are example of implications from this driving force. From the World Economic Forum, here are the biggest risks: infectious diseases, climate action failure and environmental risk, weapons of mass destruction, livelihood crisis, debt crisis, especially now that countries are borrowing funds to finance their vaccination programs, IT infrastructure breakdown, especially at this point that we are so much or we rely largely on information communication technology. Now, these driving forces can be categorized into predetermined elements, critical uncertainties, and wildcards. The predetermined elements, for example, are those that include demographic information, occupation of people, the location, the migration patterns, their age, the increase in population, among other things. Climate change to a large extent is already considered as predetermined elements because we have a lot of information already forecasting the possible effects of climate related risk. We also have here another example, the ubiquitous connective technologies. For instance, we know that 5G is already in the horizon, and many individuals, even children, will have access to mobile devices using 5G technologies. Note that predetermined elements are important to any scenario story, but they are not, according to the Rockefeller Foundation, not the foundation or the basis on which the stories will be created or constructed or built. They can add texture, twist, color to the scenarios, but the scenarios are not based on these predetermined elements. Next is what we call the wild cards. We talked about this yesterday. According to Rockefeller, these are events that have low probability of occurrence, but they have excessively high impact when they happen. Here are the examples, and I also mentioned the current pandemic as a wild card. The main role of the analysis of wildcards, however, is to detect future shocks to help prevent or minimize negative consequences to your respective organization or to maximize the positive effects of wildcards. Wildcards in themselves are, in a way, value neutral. It can have positive or negative effects depending on the context of an organization. Wildcards are elements of, but they are not the foundation of scenario stories. Again, wildcards can add a significant color, texture, and twist to the narratives or to the stories and scenarios, but they are not the basis. What are the basis in constructing the scenarios? Therefore, this will be the critical uncertainties. Scenarios are formed around what we call the critical uncertainties, or those driving forces that are considered highly important to the strategic challenge of the organization, yet highly uncertain in terms of how they will unfold in the future. Examples of critical uncertainties would be technologies with the most impact on development, global, regional, and national economic performance, education and training opportunities, considering that many schools are affected by the pandemic, conflicts in the hotspot areas, not only in the national territory, but also for example, in the West Philippine Sea area, food security, adaptive capacity, I mean, because of the risk from climate change or climate-related risk and disasters. Incidentally, adaptive capacity is also related to food security, especially in a humanitarian situation or a pandemic situation like what we have. Some areas have abundant food that they cannot transfer or transport to areas that need food. Political and economic alignment is also an example of critical uncertainty, considering that it is rare to have good political leaders and sound economic managers at the same time. Now, some of these critical uncertainties came from your suggestions yesterday, but most of these are from literature. Now we go to the next step, the building blocks. As soon as we have determined or gathered information about the different driving forces. By the way, the process of generating information about the driving forces would take some time. In one organization that we assisted, they needed at least 2 weeks to gather all information, especially that they are also multitasking. So the third step is about the building blocks. And the way to process the information would be to identify the critical uncertainties, to sort those critical uncertainties by constructing a quadrant like this one. So you have the predetermined elements, other trends, and probably wildcards if you have any. And then you put the critical uncertainties on the topmost, rightmost portion of the quadrant, which means that these critical uncertainties have high potential impact and high level of uncertainty. Now, who will decide how the information or the driving forces will be processed along this way? It will be the participants of the discussion on scenario development. So we list down the driving forces. So for example, along social, now this time, this is in relation to the provincial local government unit. So the predetermined elements would be, as a matter of example, for the social aspect, we have increase in population by 15%, which is about something that is easily can be computed based on historical data or from census information. Then from the technological aspect, we have artificial intelligence technologies in schools, offices, and some homes. Economic dimension, we have the average growth rate of, let's say, 3% of GDP. On the environment aspect, we have 10% of the GDP lost to disasters. And for the political aspect, we assume a stable political leadership in the next 9 years, which is basically 3 terms for an incoming provincial governor. Now, the wildcards, we have identified 2 in this example. We have the possible localized lockdowns due to communicable diseases, maybe less than what we are experiencing now, or perhaps similar, or perhaps worse. Another possible wildcard is commercial viability of an energy reserve, whether that is geothermal or gas reserve. So there is a natural asset in this provincial LGU that if this will be discovered and to be decided that it has commercial application and it is viable, then it will change the landscape of the landscape and future of this local government unit. Now, here are the critical uncertainties. Food security, technologies with the most impact on development, similar to what we have identified in the previous slides. We added here vulnerability to acts of terrorism. And also we have here the adaptive capacity and global, regional, and national economic performance. As soon as we have completed in listing down the different driving forces, you can have as many as 60 of these driving forces. And finally, you decide on the different critical uncertainties. So the team or the discussion team will finally choose which of the critical uncertainties will be used in creating the scenarios or stories. Which brings us to step 4, the scenario frameworks using the building blocks. In this particular step, let's focus on matrix scenario creation. There are at least two other ways of doing this, but since we started with this example of 4 scenarios or stories, let's use matrix scenario creation. And here are the steps. Construct a matrix from 2 critical uncertainties. That's the first step. So you have the vertical and horizontal lines representing the critical uncertainties. Now step number 2, try many different combinations of critical uncertainties before settling on a final matrix. So in our previous step, we identified critical uncertainties, namely food security, technologies with the most impact on development, global, regional, and national economic performance, adaptive capacity, and vulnerability to acts of terrorism. All right. So you can combine all these critical uncertainties before finally deciding which of these critical uncertainties will be used in creating the scenarios. So the third step is make sure that the final matrix is constructed from 2 independent uncertainties, which means that the 2 critical uncertainties has no cause and effect relationship and hopefully no influence in case any of them will occur or happen. Number 4, use access of the chosen matrix as driving forces to deduce 4 scenarios logics of stories. So we have here critical uncertainty 1 and 2 to create scenarios A, B, C, and D. Now the 5th step, iterate, discuss, avoid setting on a final matrix prematurely because later on you might realize that these are not the best possible combination of critical uncertainties. So you will have to go back again to this to complete this step. Now here is the example based on our model, the provincial local government unit. The 4 scenarios using the matrix scenario process. And here are the features of the PLGU. We use, in this example, 2 critical uncertainties, namely adaptive capacity, which is also related to resiliency to deal with environmental shocks, economic shocks, and even humanitarian response conditions. The arrow going up means high adaptive capacity. The arrow going down is low adaptive capacity. The other critical uncertainty is unstable or the global, regional, and national economic performance. The arrow going to the left is labeled as unstable, global, regional, and national economic performance. And the arrow going to the right is labeled as stable, global, regional, and national economic performance. Please note that in choosing the critical uncertainties, they have to be described in such a way that you can also determine the opposing directions of this critical uncertainty. High versus low, stable versus unstable, or any other themes or characterization that you will identify based on the critical uncertainties. Now, given these critical uncertainties, we can now construct our scenarios A, B, C, and D. So let us say that for scenario A, we have a survivor PLGU. Okay, so you can decide later on what will be the most appropriate description of this particular scenario. But for the sake of this presentation, here is the example. A survivor PLGU, it is proactive in dealing with economic and environmental shocks. It can tap or it taps donor and national government funds for the social services needs of the citizens. Scenario C is a vulnerable PLGU. It is susceptible to economic and environmental shocks, unstable or unable to meet the social services needs and requirements of the citizens and the stakeholders. Then we have scenario D, the firefighter PLGU, reactive in dealing with economic and environmental shocks, meets both ends to meet the social services needs of the citizens. And finally, we have the model PLGU. It has sound adaptation strategies in place, vibrant communities that are able to support their economic needs. So the future scenarios, again, or the stories are based on the critical uncertainties that will have a significant effect on what future scenario will happen for this particular LGU by 2032. So any of these scenarios can happen. In fact, a mixture or a combination of these scenarios might happen in the future. All right. And the next step, once you're able to complete step number 4 using the scenario frameworks, we go to the scenario stories. Now, storytelling is not a position. It is not an argument. It is not a statement. So no one has to be in favor or against a story. If vivid and memorable, stories can help tackle or discuss difficult issues without being argumentative. As they say, few words can evoke a world, especially if we have charismatic presenters, evocative graphics, memorable phrases, images, or archetypes, and illustrative graphs of future outlooks. In this step, here is an example of storytelling, and let's call this a descriptive storytelling. This is from Rockefeller Foundation, and it was prepared in 2010. And when I read this, if I remember that if you cannot, or if you look at the year here is 2012, but if you replace it with 2019, it sounds like a description of what we are experiencing now. So,
In 2012, the
meron pa
pandemic
akong
that the
reader.
world has been anticipating for years finally hit. Unlike 2009's H1N1, this new influenza strain originating from wild geese was extremely virulent and deadly. Even the most pandemic-prepared nations were quickly overwhelmed when the virus streaked around the world, infecting nearly 20% of the global population and killing 8 million in just 7 months, the majority of them healthy young adults. The pandemic also had a deadly effect on economies. International mobility of both people and goods screeched to a halt, debilitating industries like tourism and breaking global supply chains. Even locally, normally bustling shops and office buildings sat empty for months, devoid of both employees and customers.
Once again, if you read the story again, and if you replace 2012 with 2019 and then 2020, it is similar to what we are experiencing in 2020. Now, the pandemic in 2020 first quarter. So that's the power of a story. It can affect us because they can be so powerful and so clear and therefore vivid, and it can move us into thinking about possible solutions in order to prevent this from happening. Now, moving forward, here are example devices for storytelling. A journalist looking back from 2030 and describing what has changed in a specific organization local government unit, region, industry, or issue. Another storytelling device is someone retiring from a job in 2030 and reflecting on their career over the previous 20 years. Another device for storytelling is the story of a long distance relationship told through emails between two professionals who find their careers changing between, let us say, 2020 and 2030, or a scene in a bar set in 2030 as people reflect on how much the world has changed in the past 12 years. You can also use newspapers or TV broadcast to or as devices for storytelling. Here is an example from one of our assisted local government unit. And this is one of the stories in one of the scenarios.
My parents wanted me to work in other major cities of the country to have a better future. My parents have been running a small business and they're planning to establish a business in Manila. They are skeptical in expanding our store because they are afraid of the violence and other risks posed by the dominance of terrorist groups in our area. Terrorism has progressed. With the rise of digital infrastructure and technological breakthroughs, it has become more sophisticated, raising cybersecurity concerns as well as introducing new methods have changed from suicide bombing to a more technologically advanced terrorist attacks. Most of us are largely exposed to extremist ideologies. My friends are being recruited to join the terrorist groups. They are being promised scholarships to Middle East countries. There is limited access to education and health assistance because the priority is focused on measures taken to guard against espionage and other crimes. Citizens are keeping firearms to protect themselves.
Thank you. So that is a sad story, a sad way of telling a story based on a particular scenario. But the other scenarios can also provide us with an optimistic or inspiring stories. So this is just an example of how you might think of a story based on the particular scenario um, of the four scenarios that you have chosen or determined. If you are done with step number 5, we can proceed to step 6, the implications and options. Very important. Bottom line, what will be the implications in terms of challenges or opportunities and options in terms of key activities or strategies? So for the model PLGU, the opportunity can be to establish a haven for smart technologies. There will be others, but in this example, we have identified one opportunity or implication for each of the scenario. For the firefighter LGU, encourage the SUCs or schools, universities, and colleges to provide research and extension services to communities. For the survivor PLGU, ensure sound disbursement of public and ODA funds, especially if it is dependent on this outside funding support. For the vulnerable PLGU, focus on the most vulnerable populations given the limited financial resources. Now, given these implications, what are the possible options in terms of key activities or strategies? Ang hinahanap or what we're looking for are robust type of strategies, mga matatag na strategiya. So for example, for the model PLGU, one strategy is to provide stable power from renewable energy and setting up of high-speed satellite-based internet. For the firefighter LGU, strong partnership with stakeholders. For the survivor PLGU, tap external expertise and resources. And for the vulnerable PLGU, engage local officials in charting a common vision for local development and humanitarian response. So in this particular step, we're looking at, again, robust strategies or matatag na mga strategiya so that the provincial local government unit can survive or can be agile in responding in case any of the scenarios will unfold. If there is a combination of the scenarios in the future, then the chosen activities and strategies will help the PLGU in boosting its immune system as a local government unit. In that case, given the limitation of human and financial assets, the LGU can really focus on strategies even starting year one of the 10-year horizon. Meaning to say, or because especially that the budget will have to be made available every year through the annual investment plans, for example. So it has to be purposive so that the use of the funds should also go to the correct or appropriate strategies. And when any of the scenario unfolds, the LGU will have a better chance of survival because it is more adaptive and it is highly agile. So that is the sixth step, no, implications and options. Then based on these implications and options, what do we think would be the indicators and signposts under step number 7? So for the model LGU, the current observed trends, events can include, let's say, the growth in investments from businesses, especially if the strategy works for the LGU and it is able to invite locators, those who are offering or providing smart technologies. For the survivor LGU, it has to make sure that the national government and ODA funds are also properly monitored because at any point, the priorities of the ODA organizations and the national government might change. For the firefighter LGU, migration pattern of residents, whether that is in migration or out migration. Then for the vulnerable PLGU, the effects of climate-related risk, especially in relation to food security and safer settlements in the area. What about the future indicators to track? For the model PLGU, it will be interested to look at the new and emerging technologies for development. For the survivor, the priorities of the ODA organizations because of the other events happening throughout the world. And some of these ODA organizations which shift their priorities to other countries. Then for the firefighter LGU, they have settlement patterns, whether the residents are in safer settlement locations or they need to be transferred to safer grounds because of the effects of climate change and disasters. Then for the vulnerable LGU, what are the land use changes? Which of the agricultural lands are no longer suitable for agriculture or crop raising because of the effects of climate-related risk? Is there a change in the rainfall pattern or precipitation? Because if this LGU used to have abundant rainfall and the effect of climate change is that there will be a reduction in rainfall, then it will have a significant effect on agricultural production in this local government unit. And therefore, the zoning ordinance and the land use plans will have to be replaced or updated. So this is step number 7, and we have completed the different steps from step number 1 to step number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, in this particular walkthrough of the scenario planning process, we can also see the difference between the traditional planning approach and the scenario planning approach. In terms of perspective, the Traditional planning approach is focused on everything else being equal. So that means only focusing on partial reality. But scenario planning looks at the overall reality. So nothing else being equal. In terms of variables, traditional planning uses quantitative, the objective, and the known. In scenario planning, we rely on qualitative, not necessarily quantitative, but if there are quantitative information, also very useful for the predetermined elements. We also capitalize on subjective uh, knowledge or expertise or wisdom and the known or hidden. In terms of relationships, the traditional planning relies heavily on statistics, stable structures, with the assumption that they will continue in the future. But for scenario planning, we are careful because the world is dynamic, it is a VUCA world out there, and there are emerging structures. In terms of the pictures of the future, traditional planning assumes that the future is simple and certain. But scenario planning views the future as multiple and there is a high level of uncertainty. In terms of method, traditional planning is determinist and quantitative in its approach, using economic and mathematical models. In scenario planning, we focus on intention analysis, qualitative, and stochastic models, including cross impact and systems analysis. Stochastic models can include those or the use of random or randomization to ensure rigor in the data that will be gathered. In terms of attitude to the future, traditional planning is passive or adaptive. The future will be, let it come. For scenario planning, the, the future is, or the attitude to the future is active and creative. The future, therefore, is created. So at this point, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us in this webinar. And let me end the session with this quote. We plan because without a plan, even failure is an accomplishment. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kahes, for that wonderful presentation for our day 2 of this webinar series. We move on to the Q&A portion of our episode today. So let's start with Mr. Owen Miserio from the Department of Health. He is asking, should we also include legal aspects in determining driving forces?
Yes, sir. If you use the PESEL or the PESTEL approach, the legal is embedded there. If you use the STEEP approach, the legal aspect is part of the political cluster of driving forces.
All right, thank you, sir. And we have another question from Ms. Josefina Lakay. She is asking about the pandemic because for the health sector, what is happening right now with this calamity? Do you think contingency plans for the future will cover particular scenarios such as this COVID-19 pandemic, sir?
Definitely, because according to the World Economic Forum, for example, it's part of the powerful risk in the future. Not necessarily the kind of pandemic that we are facing today, but maybe a new species of this problem or issue. Or maybe we can have other types of communicable diseases, especially that there is the effect of climate change. We know for a fact that there are health effects of increased global warming. So we have to be ready. Our future scenarios should also consider as part of whether a wild card or a critical uncertainty or as predetermined elements, the health situation and outcomes of the different scenarios and as far as our residents are concerned. So yes, it's very important that in all of the stories, health is part of the color or the texture.
Right, thank you very much. And we also have another question from Miss Elsa Tagufa. Is it all right to not include the time horizon in the framing question? That's her question.
In terms of constructing the strategic challenge, the framing question, I should say yes, because there are three categories in step number one. The first category is the strategic challenge. The next category is the framing question of the strategic challenge. And the next category is the time horizon of the framing question and the strategic challenge. So you can just, yes, you're right. It may not be included in the framing question, but we can put it as a separate category. You know, the time horizon will have to be very specific because you will have to agree with your stakeholders. What type of future are we talking about in terms of time scale? So again, the first step is you have the strategic challenge with the framing question. You may not put the date there, but definitely you have to have another category, the time horizon.
All right, thank you so much, sir. So another question from Mr. Bayani San Juan. He is asking, the presentation only mentioned four scenarios. It seems that there can really be many scenarios that can be created. For the four matrix or quadrant presented, are we limited to four only?
What we are using in this particular approach, using the scenario matrix, is yes, you can come up with the four scenarios. More than that, maybe you will need another approach to do it. The other approaches that we learned from our trainers is using three scenarios actually, and this is the matrix scenario gives us the most number of scenarios, which is four. So I think if you would like to go for more than four scenarios, um, I cannot say for certain if that is the right thing to do. I have to check on the literature or in terms of methods if that is. Um, it can also give you some robust strategies. But if you can focus on the maximum of four scenarios, I think it will be sufficient to give you an idea what will be the robust strategies. Again, I'm not saying that more than four scenarios are not acceptable. It's just that the limitation of our technique gives us three to four scenarios.
All right, thank you, sir. So, Mr. Joel Kapalit and Miss Luz Bebelen is asking about the framing questions. So, is it okay if we have a number of framing questions instead of only one? And if what outlook do you prefer when planning? Is it long term or short term? And can we change the scenarios in the middle of the implementation?
Okay, and the first question, which is about the framing question. Yes, you can have a mother framing question, and then you can have one or two sub questions related to the framing question. On the second question, the time horizon for scenario planning or the futures thinking that we are using is 10 years or more, 10 to 15. I've seen other organizations with 20 years time horizon. So it is safe to say 10 to 20 years in the future. The other question is about the possible change of scenarios. It is an iterative process. Now, it's okay if you go back to step one after reaching step three and you have some ideas or opportunities or possible innovations, then you can go back to the first step. It's not a rigid step-by-step process that if you are done with step one and you go to step two, and if you're done with step two, you cannot go back to step one, etc. So again, it is an iterative process. But of course, you're only limited by your time and the availability of your participants and the resources that you have.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Cajes. Unfortunately, that's the only time that we have this afternoon. Thank you again for making this series very loaded with very practical and timely learnings, something that we can apply right away in our respective organizations. I can see we have a lot of comments in the chat box that we all agree how insightful this 2-day webinar has been. So we hope to see you again in our next webinars in the next few months. And dear participants, please don't forget to accomplish the evaluation form through the link that is provided right now in the chat section. Handouts and certificates will be issued only to those who will watch and evaluate both of the 2 webinar episodes. So on behalf of the Academy, I would like to thank everyone for watching. I would like to also thank Dr. Kais for joining us. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And we hope that you learned a lot from this session. I would like to give a shout out to everyone who has participated in our monthly webinars. It is really the heart of this initiative to raise awareness, especially among civil servants, on relevant productivity and innovation topics that can be applied on public sector organizations. And hopefully, we have achieved that in the last few months during this activity. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to more learning opportunities only here at the Center of Excellence on Public Sector Productivity. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, to always stay updated. Only here at the Public Sector Productivity webinars. Thank you so much and have a nice day.